Hello and welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jose Luis Granado Ceja, a Mexican journalist living and working here in Mexico City. I'm a staff writer and host of the podcast over at Venezuela Analysis. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Doing very well, Jose Luis. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin Magazine in the United States. Sentido Común here in Mexico. Ready for another episode of Soberanía. That one had a lot of juice. I have to point out before we start, Jose Luis, that you've got kind of cliche kind of a thing going on today.
Well, it's funny you should mention that because our more astute viewers will have noticed this little doll sitting on the shelf behind me. And I saw it this morning. And I was like, hey, I have a jacket that looks like that. Why not? Let's match today. Ernesto Che Guevara being a hero of Latin America, the political struggle here. Obviously, someone who fought for the defense of Soberanía.
That and more. Well, if we're doing show and tell, Jose Luis, kind of a pre-Christmas show and tell look, I've got my inauguration AMLito going across the screen here. This is inauguration AMLO. And I've also got, baseball AMLO right here, right there. So just, I know the jealousy that people must just.
I really like the baseball one. So many great Latin American leaders were big fans of baseball. Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, López Obrador, as we know. So,
me,
I think that's my favorite one. Actually, before we get started, I wanted to mention something that very cool that happened to me this weekend. I actually had somebody come up to me for the first time and be like, "Are you from Soberanía?" And I was like, "I am." Apparently, big fan. Ran into them at one of my favorite places here in Mexico City. It's called UBA. It's connected to the CCU Tlatelolco. It's a place where there's all kinds of artistic activities. It's a very, very nice space. And just happened to meet a fan in person. That was really nice. It was a nice little moment there, knowing that people do appreciate the work that we're doing here on the podcast.
Watch out, Achilles, because for now it's going to be the paparazzi. That's the next step for you.
I don't know if I can handle that.
But fleeing down a tunnel somewhere, evading the paparazzi.
It's such an interesting thing, right? Like being here and having people know you, but you don't know them. It's something I'm very much getting used to. But hey, all in the name of advancing the work, right? Of getting people information that they may not get elsewhere. Speaking of which, let's get the rundown up here on the screen. We are going to begin today's program talking about the minimum wage. Once again, for many years running now, we are seeing a sharp increase in the minimum wage here in Mexico after many, many decades of it being virtually frozen during the neoliberal era. With López Obrador, we saw an increase, and we're seeing that Claudia Sheinbaum, president, is following up on that, continuing that very popular and also very successful policy. We're also going to be talking about former U.S. ambassador to Mexico, Christopher Landau, who's been tapped for the State Department. He is likely going to become a new deputy secretary of state working under Marco Rubio, of course. And so with these people who have a lot of experience in Latin America, I think it tells us something about what Trump is thinking or aiming to do with his foreign policy. But obviously, he was ambassador in Mexico for many years during Trump's first term. And I think we might be able to provide some insights there, possibly also compare him a bit to our experience with Ken Salazar and the Democratic administration. What can we take away from those experiences and share with you now that he's going to essentially be promoted? All right. And we're going to switch things to the other side of the spectrum, also talking about Mexico and the global far right. There were a pair of conferences, gatherings very recently, and there is a Mexican connection, one in Spain, one in Argentina, and we want to talk about the implications of that. Who was there? Who was involved? What does it mean for Mexican politics? We want to do our regular segment, of course. Good news from Mexico. A certain important political person here in Mexico has been tapped for a short list. Now, I'm being intentionally vague because I want to surprise you at the end there. An interesting development. I'm not going to say that this outlet is prestigious, but nonetheless, this does merit some attention, and it speaks to Mexico's place in the world, which is starting to rise. And as always, losers and haters. We're going to be talking about the Tren Maya. So there's an article that I think missed the mark when it comes to the Tren Maya, not really understanding what is actually happening there. In fact, makes some mistakes in its reporting as well. And it being the 1-year anniversary of the inauguration of the Tren Maya, we thought we would look into that and kind of break that down for you. All right, Kurt. So we're going to start with this story about the minimum wage. And I thought I would read this headline. Ending the year on a high note, Mexico's minimum wage increases by 12%. In a bid to address poverty and improve the living conditions of the average worker, Mexico's minimum wage is set to increase next year. A 12% wage hike was announced by Mexico's labor minister during a press conference last week. The decision was not made by the minister alone and involved the three-party minimum wage commission that consisted of government representatives, as well as labor and business reps who aided in the decision-making. The minimum wage increase will go into effect January 1st, 2025. So, Kurt, once again, we're seeing an increase in the minimum wage. I don't think it was ever in doubt that Claudia Sheinbaum was going to continue with this, but I think it's worth remembering that, as I said at the beginning, the minimum wage was frozen virtually for decades.
That's right.
The neoliberal administration, López Obrador comes in and says, nope, we need to address this. We're talking about the most poorly compensated people in the formal sector here in the Mexican economy. They deserve to have more purchasing power. This can be a tool to lift people out of poverty, amongst other social programs that obviously are taking place in this country. And as a reminder, what we saw was a greater than 100% increase in the actual purchasing power of workers earning the minimum wage here in Mexico. What do I mean by that? It didn't just increase. It actually kept up with inflation and then some to actually increase their purchasing power.
Oh, yeah.
So, Kurt, we have this tweet from you here up on the screen, and I figured I'd hand it off to you. What are your thoughts here?
Well, we've been talking a lot, Jose Luis, on this program and others, like with our friends in Left Reckoning, kind of doing a balance, that how it is that, considering that there's still very different circumstances, but even so, how Moreno has been able to win 2 landslides in a row, right? Despite the same basket of international conditions, COVID, inflation, supply chain shocks, and all of this, when the Democrats have very clearly crashed and burned in our faces again. Right? So I put here, for 2025, Mexico is continuing its string of annual minimum wage increases. In the U.S., the federal minimum wage, as we know, hasn't gone up since 2009 and is stuck at $7.25. Obviously, there have been increases at the state level, but not at the federal one. So if you want to understand why Morena won and the Democrats lost this year, not to oversimplify, but you could start right here, right? A 12% increase, which is going to raise Mexico's minimum wage to 278.80 pesos a day. The minimum wage is calculated on a daily rate in Mexico, so it's not to be confused, and 419 with 88 centavos in the border area, right? To have it closer to, the U.S. there for a variety of reasons. Now, why is this important? Obviously, for the very clear reason that it's important that the lowest paid workers in any economy get paid. And it jives with the idea of por el bien de todos primeros pobres, right? But also for a very important economic phenomenon that, as we know, minimum wage increases have a knock-on effect and affect workers all the way up, the pay scale. Add to this the fact that some union contracts even have it written into their contracts that minimum wage increases have to be translated into union contracts, as we saw with the 3220 movement in Matamoros several years ago, where AMLO's first minimum wage increase actually kicked off a very interesting labor movement there in Matamoros. So, it's important for a whole variety of reasons. And actually, as others have pointed out, right, Mexico has managed to reduce poverty by 9.5 million people over AMLO's first term. This is, international figures, not just Mexican figures. And they've calculated that up to half of that, there's this social programs and other factors, is directly related to the minimum wage increase. That's how important this is. That is how important this is, right? Especially in light of the fact that throughout the long neoliberal night, right, we're talking from 82 onward, there was a massive erosion in purchasing power in Mexico, together with a series of brutal shocks. David Harvey talks about how much the Mexican public has actually had to weather, and shock after shock after shock after shock. We're talking about 2 major devaluations, the selling off of its assets, a brutal neoliberal economic austerity program, the privatization of the pension system, basically, the wholesale clearing out of the state. And together with that, the minimum wage was deliberately suppressed. It was deliberately suppressed. So a minimum wage that could provide for a family back in the 70s became a starvation wage, really a starvation wage. So with the Cuatro T, you start seeing 15 to 20% increases annually in the minimum wage. The first Sheinbaum increase is slightly less, 12%. But this is exactly what she promised in the campaign. It's exactly what she promised in the campaign with her 100 points. Exactly. And the idea is to get it up to 2.5 food baskets. That's what she wants by the end of her term, right? By 2030, to get the minimum wage back up to where it can buy 2.5 basic food baskets. And there's also been this parallel effort to work with industry to get them to hold down the prices of that food basket without it having to, without having to resort to price controls. Right? It's really interesting in Mexico. It's being an observer of Mexican politics. This idea of creating consensuses among the sectors, which is kind of an old idea of the kind of the post-revolutionary idea from the PRI that's held over. So when you saw the minimum wage increase be announced, you had employers groups and union groups on the stage, all of them together on the same stage, extolling the policy. Something that obviously would never happen in the global north, right, where there's much more of a directly adversarial, at least ostensibly, relationship between.
On that point, Kurt, it's quite interesting, right? What changed? The government changed. I mean, it's still some of the same people who were part of these commissions, these same groups, the same labor organizations. But as we see here on the screen, right, it's dramatic increase. You can follow along the years. Where's the sharpest increase? Well, López Obrador, and now with Claudia Sheinbaum, where we actually see the increase. That's the only difference, is that a popular leftist progressive government came in and said, this is not acceptable anymore. Funny how all of that changed with a change of the executive.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not trying to contend that Mexico has an enlightened industrialist sector. But it's just this interesting phenomenon in Mexican politics of attempting to create these apparent consensuses, right, around policies like the minimum wage and get everybody on the same stage. And it's also a testament to the fact that the wages are so low in Mexico that employers don't even see these increases as a threat. That's how low wages have been in Mexico. Yeah. And, despite all the screaming that here in Mexico and everywhere on the moon, that wage increases are going to lead to inflation, Mexico's inflation rate for November was 4.55%, down 0.2 from the previous month. Now, part of that, we also have to say, has to do with the fact that Mexico has very high interest rates. And so it'd be very nice if the Bank of Mexico decided to knock those down a little bit. Right?
Yes.
It's also a testament to the fact that everybody who said that minimum wage increases, and this is now 7 consecutive years of this, we're going to lead to inflation, were wrong or lying. They were wrong or lying or both. So, it's a great example of how you just never listen to those people. Never, ever, ever listen to those people. Or if you do listen to them, do the exact opposite, Jose Luis.
And keep it in mind, right, when that argument has come up in your countries. I know we have a lot of viewers and listeners in the United States, and that's been the argument. Oh, inflation. And then obviously there was a global inflationary pressure in the post-pandemic era. But of course they use that. No, now is not the time. And later on, it'll be another excuse. But it's what they are at the end of the day.
It's never the time. Yeah.
And in fact, I really like this graphic.
In the U.S., it's never the time to discuss gun violence. It's never the time to discuss wage increases, right?
But speaking of the global context, right, I thought I'd put this one up here. This is in the G20 countries, and only Russia has actually increased its, and that's actually due to them trying to keep up with a bit of the inflationary pressures as a result of sanctions and the rest of it. But we can see that Mexico is leading the way in the global community. And I think this is also really important. I was reminded a bit, I saw a clip from Claudia's inauguration where she kind of, speaks about some of the accomplishments that were secured during López Obrador's government, saying about lifting people out of the minimum wage, not necessarily having to increase government revenue by increasing taxes. And she asks, a rhetorical question: how is this possible? It's because the development model changed. Well, the development model also implies higher wages for the people at the lowest rung of the formal economy, right? Absolutely. And that's why we see this. So really, really encouraging data here. Kurt, I was wondering if there's anything else you wanted to say about this. I'm really glad you said the inflation thing, because that's the number one argument. What else comes to mind when we talk about the minimum wage?
I just wanted to really reinforce the point that The idea was to starve people to death with a starvation wage, and I'm not exaggerating. That was the way Mexico was portrayed to, its partners in the free trade agreement and to the rest of the world, right? Come to Mexico to, take advantage of cheap starvation labor. To this day, in Oaxaca, where I live, if you make $400 a month, you're doing pretty well.
Yeah.
Now the minimum wage has come up to just about that. So that's going to force wages. That's going to force, and there are plenty of people who make less. And keep in mind how much rents have gone up, especially in touristy cities like Oaxaca. How much housing prices and other things have gone up. People can't. You just can't. You just can't. And that was the model, right? It was work people to death, house them in deficient housing projects way outside of the city. We've talked about the new housing plan to build 1 million units, so that didn't happen. You'd have to work 2 to 3 hours, travel 2 to 3 hours a day, sometimes each way in cities like Mexico City to get back and forth from your starvation job, right? And then, they privatized your pension. They were in the process of dismantling the health service. So that was it. That was going to be your life. So raising the minimum wage, as basic as it sounds, as fundamental as it sounds, has been a lifeline for millions of people. Has been a lifeline. And it's a testament to the fact that sometimes, we overthink things and we do academic studies and we do this and we do that and we have to implement some kind of very complicated anti-poverty strategy, and maybe we should means test and maybe we should focus it in this and whatever else than that. Stop. Just pay people more. Pay people more. Give people money. So they don't have to, go through starvation wages and die at 55. Start with that.
Imagine that.
Went there.
Perhaps that helps explain why people are generally happier these days. The happiness index is increasing here in Mexico. But of course, I think one thing I wanted to say before we move on to our next topic here is that, there was a logic to this, right? These starvation wages responded to the place that the global bourgeoisie wanted for Mexico, for Mexican
Absolutely.
labor, for Mexican products. It was always viewed as a place for cheap labor, cheap products. We have to suppress wages if we have to. We have to engage in a neo-colonialism if we have to get access to the resources. We have to support fraudulent elections and fraudulent presidents if we have to, right? That was the way things were in Mexico. And then things changed, right?
Oh, and one more point on this. This is, of course, why the United States, deindustrialized. They were tempted by the swan song of cheap wages abroad, right? You think capitalists are patriots? They don't give a crap. They don't give a crap about you or your community. They will ship their jobs to wherever wages are cheapest. And the threat hanging over Mexico was, if you dare to raise your wages, we'll move on.
Yeah.
And then with all these threats, they then tried to pit workers against each other on different sides of the border. So you'd even hear U.S. leftists say, they shipped our jobs to Mexico, right? As if Mexico was at fault for that. As if Mexicans were the bad guys here. And that was a problem with the U.S. left and the Canadian left. They shipped our jobs to Mexico, pitting workers against each other, right? And then they'd pit Mexican workers against Indonesia or Bangladesh or wherever was the next port of call. So this is why the left has to recover this idea of international solidarity that got lost in there somewhere. Right, Jose Luis? This idea of don't allow them to pit workers on both sides of the border against each other, for God's sake.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned the word, paying attention, internationalism, the cause. And so we're going to be talking about Christopher Landau and his appointment to Deputy Secretary of State in the United States. It's very important for us here in Mexico to pay attention to the United States and what's happening there. But we wanted to include this precisely because we do have some experience with this particular character. So I want to begin this segment by talking and reading out here what Mr. Landau said himself upon this nomination. And the pictures are quite interesting. I'm sure we'll get into that in a second, but give me a second here. I'm deeply honored and grateful for this nomination, the opportunity to work with Senator Marco Rubio to implement President Donald Trump's foreign policy agenda. I only wish my parents were still alive to hear the news, as my father was a career Foreign Service officer and my mother a consummate diplomatic spouse. The nomination is a tribute to them, the best possible teachers of what it means to be a diplomat and an American. I look forward to confirmation process in the U.S. Senate. Now, he mentioned the confirmation process there at the end, it's quite likely he's going to go through. Wasn't a particularly controversial figure. In fact, he made less headlines than Ken Salazar did in his time as ambassador. But this background's kind of interesting. The fact that he highlights it, I think, is very much a sign of who he is. Landau presents himself. He's a lawyer and he's worked on high-profile things. I think he clerked with the Supreme Court. So he's, without any doubt, an elite of the United States political establishment, obviously having parents who were in the Foreign Service. But he's also a big Trump guy. I mean, there's a reason Trump essentially promoted him, giving him this post in the State Department instead of just asking him to be ambassador again. And so I think part of it is interesting, and we can talk about what it might mean. But even this, right? What does he choose to highlight? That's his dad there, career Foreign Service, with Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. Ronald Reagan, the celebrity of the conservative right in the United States. So, Kurt, I wanted to turn it over to you to ask, what do you think are the takeaways here? What would you say, based on what you saw from Landau while he was ambassador? What does this tell us about what he possibly could be doing now that he's going to be in the Department of State?
Well, I think we should have under no illusions as to who Landau is, right? He's a Reagan-Trump Republican, right? And that's clear. That's clear. But, we have to look at this from a Mexican point of view. And, they never have illusions about ambassadors from either party, right? That one party is better than the other. And it's actually a point that, a number of people have made, that Landau was somewhat rather less metiche in his time. Metiche means when you stick your nose in things, right? Than Ken Salazar was, who was constantly getting involved in domestic politics. As we've talked
about those energy interests, Kurt.
Yeah, that's right. Mr. Energy Lobbyist, right? Opposing energy reform, opposing the judicial reform, going to National Palace once a week, right? Going around and doing the circuit with governors, right? Presenting himself as an opposition figure, right? Holding press conferences with multinational energy corporations, right? Really pushing his agenda, right? And trying to do it with the whole kind of 10-gallon hat and guy smiling, I'm your friend kind of thing, which is kind of classic, Democratic Party hypocrisy. Landau was rather more clear, and in that sense, easier to read, right? He's got the Trumpian line on fentanyl on the border, right? And as I think we'll see here in a minute, he had that very insidious tweet during the campaign, playing up the terrorism angle with regards to the border, right? And here's the tweet right here, right? Which was, right during the campaign, right? And in response to a Musk tweet, right? But if something would happen, crossing the border, a relationship would suffer the consequences, right? This whole thing, right? Scare tactics just in time for the election, right? And he's also tried to make this ridiculous point that Mexico doesn't have sovereignty because it doesn't have, control of its borders, and anybody coming from the United States, which routinely messes with, dismantles, and destroys countries' sovereignty, like we're seeing right now with Syria, should shut the F up trying to lecture anybody else about any other country's sovereignty, right? So that's when you're like really STFU, right, with regards to Landau and his, cleverly election-timed terrorist threats about the border. But that all said, as I said, Mexicans don't have illusions about these people. The question is very pragmatically how you're going to deal with, right? It could be the case that Landau is easier to deal with because he's got the two big Trumpian issues, which is the border and fentanyl. Doesn't appear to be particularly interested, as Salazar was, about Mexican domestic affairs, right? The Trump team in general is not particularly interested in the rest of the world. They're not curious people, right? They're not particularly, concerned or, in many cases capable of getting into the nitty-gritty of these things. So they just want their their top button, high profile issues taken care of. And it's, interesting that even Claudia Sheinbaum in her press conference a couple of days ago spoke fairly positively about it. She said, Landau is going to be a subsecretary of state, and we think that's a good thing. Not saying that anybody likes Landau, but I think the idea is, kind of more of a straight shooter on things, not saying anything good, but more of a straight shooter on things and not playing the hypocritical Ken Salazar game, may actually prove to be a net benefit to Mexico.
I totally agree. I totally agree with you. I think having Landau in a key position, knowing his familiarity with Mexico, he's actually fluent in Spanish as well. So I think in that sense, it facilitates communication. Having someone who is in a high position inside of the Trump government that already has a relationship with the Mexican government, I don't think is a bad thing. I mean, we have to understand things. I don't want to sound like I'm defending anybody in the Trump administration either.
No,
but
of course not.
For Mexico, it's about Mexican issues. What's best for Mexico?
That's right.
And so I think, like you said, he's a bit of more of a straight shooter, but also his focus on these key things means that, like Trump, if you handle those, right, if you have him understand that Mexico is taking certain steps, that it is working in collaboration with the United States around their priorities and how they want to handle the issue, then you're going to have them off your back. And that's largely what it was like during Trump's first administration here in Mexico. I actually think in a lot of ways, as you mentioned, it was a little bit more complicated with the Democrats in the White House for Mexico because they want to defend the interests of U.S. capital that wants to come into Mexico and exploit its energy resources. And they had somebody as ambassador who was very well versed in that whole world and was very active in doing it, obviously trying to be careful, but definitely, as we talked on this program, overstepped the line on several occasions. And I can't really think of a single one where Landau was inappropriate in terms of diplomacy, right? We don't know what happens behind closed doors. We don't know who he was meeting with. Again, I'm not trying to provide cover for him, but I do think that in our experience, in some ways, it was actually better. And I do think that it's beneficial for Mexico to have somebody that, dare I say, a friend inside of the Department of State, which is, again, being led by Marco Rubio. Now, to talk a little bit about him, I know we've mentioned it before, but he's someone who has pursued regime change throughout the hemisphere, throughout the globe, really. His focus seems to be mostly on China. So I think Latin America will take somewhat of a backseat, as it tends to when it comes to other more pressing issues in the U.S. foreign policy agenda. But Marco Rubio for Latin America, if he got his way, would be very dangerous. He seems to have a distaste for anything that is progressive or left of center or leftist or socialist, right? He is one of the most fierce critics of the Bolivarian government in Venezuela, the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, the revolutionary government of Cuba, obviously these left-wing governments in the region, and has actively worked to oppose them, right? So I would imagine that Marco Rubio in some ways views Mexico the same way, right? And it's on the doorstep, right? Another leftist in the region, these socialists, quote unquote. And having somebody like Landau, if he handles that file, would actually be better in that sense too. But before we move on from him, I do think a couple of things here, right? It's interesting to see, like you said, his overtly political statements that came out around the election time, somewhat breaking with the tradition of diplomats staying out of electoral politics. So clearly, again, right, another sign that he's very much somebody in the mold of MAGA and Trump who is willing to kind of break those conventions. And then the final thing I wanted to say is this, where he talked about, in fact, in that tweet that we had on earlier, I'll read it out of here again. If there is a terrorist attack in the United States committed by someone who crosses the border from Mexico, that border will never return to normal. And that actually did have some reverberations here in Mexico. And I think that if I was going to point to something that makes me a little bit nervous or suspicious, it would be that statement, right? When I saw that, I was like, it almost sounds like you're wishing something like this would happen so you can crack down and seal off the border and use it as an excuse. As we know, in U.S. history, Kurt, you can fill it in with the major incidents here. The United States foreign policy establishment has always taken advantage of attacks, terrorism, false flags, in order to advance what are other.
Yes. I think it's very important what you said. Like, it was almost as if he were wishing something like that were to happen, right? And we saw just yesterday, before we're filming this episode, a very bizarre case in a Volaris flight where someone wanted to hijack the flights and fly it into the U.S. Very bizarre. It was very bizarre, and actually, people on the flight tackled them, and it didn't happen. Thankfully. But then they put the guy in the car, and then the car that he was in had a crash, it was just a series of bizarre incidents, and you get people kind of scratching their heads saying like, huh? Right? Huh? Not saying that was a false flag, but it certainly, gets people wondering when you hear rhetoric like that, that was obviously election timed, if they don't want to try to provoke something to justify something larger. In that context, right? I was watching a video just yesterday of the former U.S. ambassador to Panama under Trump, who actually, fell out with that gang. And he said, "Oh yeah, they definitely want to do Mexico. They definitely want to do Mexico." This was him, So just to look at the other side of this, they definitely want to do Mexico. They're not going to send in columns of open troops, but they want to do covert operations with 5 or 6 elites, members of, the elite Marines, the elite Army units, the Rangers, whoever else, swoop in to grab cartel leaders, right? Exactly like they did with Maya Zambada. Apparently, we don't know. And this is the problem. You can criticize Trump all you want, and we will and have. But the Democrats do things that then open the door for the Republicans to, do that and more, right? The Democrats under Biden have apparently kidnapped a Mexican citizen for, atrocious a person as he is, on Mexican soil, which establishes the precedent that they can come in and then kidnap anyone. A political enemy, a political foe, an uncomfortable journalist, whomever, right? Because the precedent is now established that the United States can come in and do what are called renditions, right? We've seen this, from the Clinton, Obama, Bush administration, whatever else, that they can just swoop into any country, do a third rendition, and then take them anywhere. So apparently now, if this former ambassador is to be believed, this is what they're trying to hatch. They don't want to do like an open invasion, which would obviously get a lot of blowback, but these kind of targeted kidnappings. And if Landau is going to be in the State Department facilitating that, then that would be, with all of his Mexico knowledge and all of his Spanish, that could also be very bad as well. So, I mean, let's not, take our eye off the other part of it too.
Absolutely. And in another tweet, he mentioned, I respect Mexico's sovereignty as I hope that people respect the U.S. sovereignty. So, he's on the record about that. And if we see something like that happen, we'll be able to criticize and be like, I thought you said you believed in sovereignty. These actions are a violation of Mexican sovereignty. If you don't have our permission, you can't come and do this. And I love that you mentioned this, yet the U.S. government has already done.
Has already done it.
On Monday's press conference, once again, the president was asked, do you have any update? What's going on with the Maya Zambada thing? Nothing. And they won't even tell us what they did because they know that if they admit it, they'll be like, we can't really admit that we violated your sovereignty, establishing this precedent. It's terrible. All right, moving on to our next topic here, Mexico and the global far right. So we had a couple of events happening very recently here. We had this article from La Jornada, Salinas Pliego, our least favorite Mexican ruling class member, who traveled to Argentina looking for investment opportunities, posing with this
investment opportunities.
Stupid pose. What is that?
Yeah.
God. But anyway, somebody else will have to explain that to me. And also the CPAC conference that happened in Argentina, which obviously is a gathering of much of these, right-wing, far-right, so-called libertarian forces at the global stage, Atlas Network connected people, et cetera, et cetera. We'll go through the pictures there as well. But worth mentioning the Mexico connection. Verástegui, who was a very brief presidential candidate here in Mexico, went to CPAC and he said, we're going to make a political party. We're going to try what Felipe Calderón and his spouse were unable to do, is to create a to the right of the PAN party to seek the presidency in 2030. All right. And then, of course, this NEOS conference as well. We'll get into that in just a minute. But your thoughts here on CPAC, Verástegui, Milei, Salinas Pliego, the far right, spending a lot of time together.
Well, English speakers need little introduction to CPAC, right? This Christian Political Action Committee, which was the great vehicle for Reaganism, and really sealed the unholy alliance of corporate elite power and fundamentalist religious base fervor, which created the new right in the United States. So basically, they're trying to find the way to replay that in Latin America. That's the long and short of it. And they have their target countries. You know, CPAC was here. CPAC's been here a couple of times. Mexico is a big target country for them. And of course, Argentina is their big, baby now because they've got Javier Milei in power there. That's their big, wow, right? Their big base now in Latin America. Just to give a little bit of context from the Mexico point of view, which is very important, as we've talked about in the program, the Mexican right is in a sad, deplorable state. I mean, really just pathetic and abject, right? Sometimes we're getting on them almost too much, we're crushing them too much, and then, it's creating all these other possible alternatives, right? But, the PRI is in crisis with this perennial leadership of the uber corrupt Alito Moreno, former governor of Campeche, which they can't get rid of. The PAN is in crisis with leadership of Marco Cortés being turned over to the uber corrupt Jorge Romero. So the Mexican right is going nowhere fast. So what you see now is right-wing elements in Mexico trying to explore other avenues. You even saw the former presidential candidate, Xochitl Galvez, saying that she wanted to try to start a new party, and Guadalupe Acosta Naranjo from the PRD saying everybody wants to start a new party now. Everybody, it's like, let's break out a board game and let's start a new party, right? Not that easy in Mexico because there's a lot of hoops you have to jump through and such. AMLO did it very quickly, but they don't have an AMLO. They don't have that star power to bring it all together. And what you see on the screen here is this cheap joke of a former actor, Eduardo Verástegui, who tried to run as an independent candidate and is very much in the U.S. line of right-wing politicians of doing prayer on the stage and shooting his gun in his spots, whatever else. That doesn't play well in Mexico, fortunately. The Mexican public is much wiser to that crap, right? That really plays well in, sadly, large budgets. It does not play well in Mexico. Seeing somebody, a guy like that obviously from the elite, shooting a gun and, and praying up on stage, where Mexico has a very long tradition of a very strict separation of church and state. You'll never see a Mexican president come out of church and be filmed coming out of church or praying or talking about their faith or taking a vow, an oath on a Bible. None of that, ever. None of that. Not even conservative presidents would be seen coming out of a church or something like that. That is how strict the separated church and state is in Mexico. And so you see somebody like that trying to do the U.S. model. It fortunately doesn't take. But of course, this isn't stopping them from trying. So you see a bunch of these, far-right golems heading down to the CPAC in Argentina, trying to, get something going. And you see, as we saw before, Salinas Pliego, Mexico's favorite tax cheat. Here you see some of the Bolsonaro family. They're allied, of course, with Jose Antonio Cast, who's very likely to be the next president of Chile, right? Of course, the head of Vox, the Spanish party Vox there, right? So this is how this rolls. The Spanish ultra-right and the Latin American ultra-right, and as we'll see in a minute, how that works over in the Spanish Peninsula with some of the rest of the dregs of Mexican politics. But this is very clearly the idea. This is very clear idea to try to get something going and try to import Milei-ism into Mexico, just like they're importing Milei-ism into the United States through Elon Musk's Department of Governmental Efficiency, which very much is based, will base itself on the Milei model, right? Very clearly. Now, over in Spain, meanwhile, we have the Fundación Neos, which is, one of these classic peninsular fascist organizations. We can put up their webpage in a second. It's very amusing. And they had a conference the other day, Friends Forever. Sounds like a cheesy musical from the 70s, right? Amigos para siempre. Over 700 people met at the Neos Forum with leaders such as Isabel Diaz Ayuso. Oh, who's that? The president of the Community of Madrid, the PP president of the Community of Madrid, who let thousands of old, senior citizens die in their retirement homes during COVID. This is who Ayuso is. And, who gave big fat contracts to, who was it, a brother or brother-in-law for masks during COVID. I mean, not only corrupt, but I mean, really just How many senior citizens died under her watch? This is who I use. This is who these people are, right? And of course, who's there? Look, oh, it's Felipe Calderon.
Of course.
Mexico's spurious former president, who stole an election in 2006 and now lives in Spain, attending pathetic forums like this. And who is the person 1, 2, 3 down from Felipe Calderon? Oh, look, it's Ciro Gomez Leiva. It's Ciro Gomez Leiva, Mexico's awful radio host on Radio Formula, whose only function now is to snip at who's on the show with him, who goes on once a week?
Epigmenio
Ibarra, right? Because he's, just bitter and angry.
He seems like a very upset man. Like he can't contain himself anymore. Right. It's interesting, right? He'll probably say, "Oh, I was just the moderator." Would I accept an invitation to moderate an event with these characters? Absolutely not. But he has no problem with it, which speaks to his ideology. It reveals who he's always been. We've always known, but it's something that he tries to hide behind, the shield of I'm just a journalist and I'm just asking questions. But who are his friends?
Don't shoot me. I'm just the host. Yeah. BS, right? And he's off to live in Spain too, right? Yep. Ciro, he's off to live in Spain too. All embittered to enjoy his ill-gotten earnings over the years, so he can join Calderon and Enrique Peña Nieto, who are living the life of Riley over in Spain. At least Peña Nieto has the good sense to not do events like this. He's much more discreet. But Calderon has become one of these obnoxious, unbearable, former presidents who thinks he's relevant still.
Like Pastrana from Colombia.
Oh, God, yes. So if you have it, put the Fundación Neos on the screen there, because this is really amusing. So Fundación Neos says, porque no todo vale, because not everything goes, or not everything is acceptable, right? And if you go down a little bit to what their issues are, it's like a comic parody of any far-right organization that has, more money than actual brains. So, of course, the abortion thing, of course, the Libertad Carajo thing, of course, they're all, the biblical thing. But then I've got the Spanish nation, Hispanidad, right? These people are obsessed with this fascist peninsular Hispanidad, right? And the so-called attacks on the Spanish language. And they're trying to promote this global Panispanidad to nations that were colonized and genocided by these people. Good luck with that. Right? We're your friends. And it's funny that all of this is coming in the context of what we talked about a few episodes ago, right? When Claudia Sheinbaum did not invite the King of Spain to her inauguration. Because the King of Spain not only didn't answer Lopez Obrador's letter of 2019, but then leaked it to the press. And if you go back to that letter, Jose Luis, because I reread it the other day, that letter is such a diplomatic letter, because that letter also recognizes the atrocities committed by the Mexican state in the post-independence era against indigenous communities, like the Yaquis and the War of Castes in the Yucatan Peninsula. It recognized the Mexican state's complicity in many of these atrocities post-independence. So what Lopez Obrador said in this letter is, let's do a joint ceremony where we recognize what we did post-independence. You guys recognize what you did before that, and we can, to an extent that it's possible, do a reset in relations. It was idea to do a joint recognition of historical culpability. No, nothing, zero. And it's actually at this conference with Calderon and Ciro Gomez Leiva, they spent a lot of time whining and moaning about precisely that, whining and moaning about why the fact that the king wasn't invited to the inauguration. And, anytime any Latin American country dares to talk about the history, they say, oh, they son resentidos. They're just all, they're burning with resentment. And you can't leave the past behind. And, basically, history doesn't exist. We only have to look forward, not backward, forward, and do 2 twirls like the guy, like the alien in the Simpsons episode. And this is the constant rhetoric. Oh, you can't look back. You can't have resentment. You can't be complex. They use that a lot too. Acomplejados. They're full of complex. They're full of resentment. When all they want is a basic historical accounting. They're not going to bring the dead back to life. They want a basic historical accounting. No, you're resentful. You're complexed. And so then they hold these little conferences because they got plenty of people with plenty of money to whine and moan with each other, with people like Calderon and Gomez Leiva and the like. And, it's all in the context of them desperately trying to find some kind of alternative to Mexico's moribund right wing here in the country, right?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Speaking of Mexico, we're going to move on to our next topic here. Good news from Mexico.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I'm going to be very brief. I just wanted to throw this out there. Time released its shortlist for its People of the Year, and none other than La Presidenta Claudia Sheinbaum made the list. Now, I'm not going to exalt too much because there's some terrible company on this list. I'll scroll up to the top so you can get an idea of who's on there. Elon Musk, Donald Trump, Kate Middleton for some reason, a loser presidential candidate in Kamala Harris. But I do think it speaks to something. It speaks to the fact that the world is paying attention to Mexico, that Mexico,
this is true,
place in the world is growing, that people are finally, as you know, we've been talking about how we've been begging people to pay attention to Mexico. Now they are. And in a lot of ways, I think the U.S. election result made people realize, so what's happening there that's different? Why didn't things go that way? By the way, we did a show with Left Reckoning where we talked a lot about this, and that actually was just made public to everybody. And it was only for patrons for a while.
Check that out.
Released. We'll put that in the description as well if you want to check out the interview we did with our friends from Left Reckoning. Love that show. Recommend them as well. They always recommend our show as well, so it's nice to have that shared love. But if you want to hear more about our breakdown of that, please check that out. Like I said, we'll put it in the link and we'll retweet it on our social media. But Mexico occupying a bigger place in the world, people paying attention, people drawing lessons. And I think this is really, really important. I was on a TV show last night and I said the same thing. If you want to have a better relationship between Canada and Mexico, Canada needs to pay more attention. You when you think about Mexico, when you're in Canada, you think about beaches and you think about drugs and the sepia filter on everything. There's actually something very exciting happening here. There's a reason why we're a happy country. I went to a conference the other day, many months ago, and David Harvey comes out and he's like, oh, it's really good to hear to be in Mexico because the rest of the world has gone to shit. And everybody who comes here realizes that there is a sense of optimism in this country. So, when Even Time, which is not a progressive outlet in any regard, starts to pay attention to that, putting Claudia Sheinbaum on the short list, I think speaks to that. And before we move on to losers and haters, I did also want to put up this piece from Jacobin that you wrote very recently, published just the other day. Mexico could weather tariffs, Trump could not. And obviously you get into this as well. But interestingly, in this piece, you speak to that. You speak to the fact that people are paying attention as they should be. And there's a lot of lessons to be drawn from this. Any words before we move on?
Yes, very briefly, because you're right. Time magazine doesn't deserve that much of our time. This is the magazine that did that infamous cover of Enrique Peña Nieto saving Mexico back in he was privatizing the oil industry back in 2013-14. But it is very much a barometer of what you said, that the international community is paying attention. And actually, people are paying attention to this article. I'm very gratified to say this article has really spiraled in Twitter, this Jacobin piece. So I'm very gratified for that. Thanks all for your reads, shares, and support there.
We'll put that in the description as well.
Please, thank you. And just a very brief anecdote as well, like the program you were talking about, once a year, I go to Thanksgiving just to kind of, again, put my barometer in my, with the gringo community. Interesting to see what they're saying, talking, the expat gringo community here. Everybody's talking about Claudia Sheinbaum.
Yeah.
The way that they didn't talk about López Obrador was that, López Obrador this, López Obrador that, because López Obrador is the quintessential Mexican and talks to the Mexican public. With wonderful charisma and historical understanding. And, the rest of the world, he's not particularly concerned about, even though he was, when he did do foreign trips, he did them very well. But Claudia Sheinbaum, who, we have to say it, is from their same socioeconomic class, is whiter, speaks English, did her doctorate in California, she can communicate to that audience in a certain way that AMLO didn't and wasn't interested in doing, really. And that's an advantage in this second round against Trump, right? Trump already did this whole tariff threaten thing in May and June of 2019. And we've been harping here a long time that the Mexican government has to do a better outreach, English language outreach strategy. Claudia Sheinbaum is uniquely positioned to do that. She's uniquely positioned to do that because of who she is, and of course, being the first female president, and just for the simple and unfortunate fact that she looks more like them, so they're more willing to listen to her. All right, but take advantage of that. And at the time when, U.S. credibility is destroyed in the world because of Gaza and Syria and God knows, South Korea and Romania and Georgia. It's like one country a day Biden is, incending the world, burning up the world before our eyes. So there's a huge potential reservoir of goodwill in the world against the United States and in favor of any country that stands up to the United States. And again, Claudia Sheinbaum is the person uniquely positioned to make that case to Middle America in a way that I think probably no other Mexican leader in the past could have done. So I think this is a unique opportunity for her to do that, and I hope she does.
I hope she does too. All right, on our final segment before we close out today's program, losers and haters. We're talking about this piece from IPS News. Emilio Godoy, who we should come out and say from the beginning, is a fierce critic of López Obrador, of La 4T, obviously of Claudia Sheinbaum. And I do think that some of his bias, unfortunately, comes through in this piece. And, well, you have it here. Maya Train is yet to deliver promised benefits. And I'll go ahead and read a couple of the first lines here, and then we'll break it down for you. Indigenous craftsperson Elisa Pech doesn't know about the Maya Train, the Mexican government's most emblematic mega project that runs through 5 states in the country, south and southeast. Quote, we don't travel. We lack the resources to travel on the train here. Who wouldn't like to get on and ride somewhere? Right now, there are no visitors, no people coming. We think by December there will be a bit more, end quote, the 44-year-old Mayan woman told IPS. So, and then the story goes on to talk about, through narratives about people in the area, about how basically the project has not been able to achieve its self-stated goals. Now, what were those? Well, this was probably the most serious attempt to invest using public resources in the poorest, most marginalized parts of the country. So obviously, as we talked about, Mexico South, Guerrero, Chiapas, Oaxaca are amongst the poorest states, but also the states of the Yucatan Peninsula are also very marginalized. Their economy was at one point revolved around Enequim. Obviously, that changed. And then, without getting to too much detail, to the present era, everyone focused on tourism. Many viewers and listeners have likely visited the Mexican Caribbean, have been to Cancun and Merida and these places. But the idea behind this train was to invest, to provide jobs, direct jobs, indirect jobs as a result of this huge mega project, this huge investment. It's betting on rail over bus travel. There is a monopoly, ADO, that largely controls everything and makes travel prohibitively expensive for many people. It's about facilitating movement of people, but also of goods, of having artisans be able to take things to market. And obviously also a reivindication, a celebration of Mayan culture. The Mayan people did not disappear. They still live in Mexico and in Central America, in the Yucatan Peninsula. And, that's been one of the things that they've criticized, calling it an appropriation. But I think it's been done in a respectful way of celebrating the culture, of making a central part of its branding, of its imaging, of all the efforts that went into actually, having archaeological digs in the areas where there was construction, all this. There was an environmental impact.
Natural reserves.
Yeah. The expansion, right? The Parque Jaguar, and these efforts to precisely mitigate against all of these criticisms at the environmental impact of this. And of course, I think it's a bit rich. It's obviously less impactful to have a train that carries hundreds of people than one bus that carries maybe 50 people spewing diesel up and down the highways, which obviously also have fees involved in it as well. So that was the Maya Train. That is the Maya Train. And in fact, this week they announced some tourism packages there, making it more affordable, getting people to become familiar with it, right? It's only been open for a year. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of been a staggered opening with little pieces of it coming together. But this piece just goes after basically saying that all of these things never actually happened, that everybody's unhappy, that this was a mistake to have pursued. And of course, basically declaring the Tren Maya dead 1 year after barely making it out into the world. And Kurt, I know that you've also had a chance to really kind of get into this article here with a fine-tooth comb and point out some of its defects in its analysis and mistakes.
I read through it, and then also really the very detailed analysis by a friend of the show, Etienne von Bertrab. So a shout out to Etienne there, who is really an expert in this, and really pointed out some important things. From the beginning, it says that the train is intended for tourists. No, actually, it's intended for anyone who tourists, local people. They're adding cargo trains on there, and it's part of a nationwide effort to bring rail transportation back. It's not just an isolated project. Claudia Sheinbaum is actually going to build twice as many kilometers of trains over her administration to complement this. So it's not just a one-off tourist train like the Copper Canyon train or something like that. It's part of a nationwide plan to bring trains back. There's this idea that the article says there's been more than 20 accidents. Well, where have those been? There was one minor derailment in a station, but this lurid sensationalism of more than 20 accidents, where have those been? Then it talks about revenue that goes into the military coffers. Yes, the military built this, but this is the idea. And, they built it because actually they approached Fonatur first to build it, and Fonatur didn't have the technical know-how to build it. So, take that into consideration. So this idea that the money's going to go directly to buy, guns and bombs, right, rather than it being part of the overall public budget. The idea that stops are located outside towns and cities, making mobility difficult. First of all, there's a whole bunch of very interesting and innovative public transportation solutions to get people from cities to the stations, and it also overlooks a very important point. The routes and station locations were negotiated with the communities themselves. And actually, they listened to communities, because if you want a train to get to the center of a city that's already built, not a city that was in construction, like the Victorian railways of London or Europe of the 19th century, which were built basically in tandem with expanding cities. These cities already exist. That would have meant displacing people. That would have meant displacing whole communities to get the train to get into those downtown stations. And a lot of those communities balked at that. They didn't want to be moved. They said, okay with the train, but we don't want to be displaced. So at that point, you decide, do you do forced displacement? Because they would have been criticized for that too. They would have been criticized to do the forced displacement. Or do you build the stations outside of the cities and have a rail link or have a transportation link? So it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't on that, right? And then it kind of brings this idea up that the stations are built outside of the cities to avoid protests and urban disruption. Well, if you mean by urban disruption forced displacement of communities, then I guess yes. The communities didn't want to be moved. We're talking about, Merida, Campeche. So they built the stations outside of the cities. That's what happened there, right?
And then they invested in public transit to bring.
And they invested in public transit. Like Campeche is doing a very interesting train there to, it's like the idea is to make the train look bad in any possible light, anything they do, right? And that's when you see that this is just a hit piece, right? There are things to criticize, about how they planned the routes and how they maybe in some cases were too accommodating, to the hotel interests and such. Okay. But this is just an attempt to make any possible decision, even decisions that were made in consensus with communities, look bad. Just make it look bad, right? Then he talks about, there are stray dogs at the stations. Well, there are stray dogs everywhere in this country. So what does that mean? What does that mean? That there maybe better effort should be made to control the pet population, which people are working on. But does that call into question the whole project? Because there are a few stray dogs at the stations, and because, all of the routes aren't operating yet. So, not every single train is full, although plenty of them are. And this idea also that to increase revenues and minimize losses, they decided to extend the train to Progreso, right? Which would be a high revenue line. That's false. Progreso was always part of the plan. having the train go into Prague so was always part of the plan. And then this for me is the capper, the real capper to all of this. Stations were defined in terms of serving the greatest number of locations, thus covering the greatest amount of demand, and this implies losses. Well, yes, because it's a train in the public interest that they want to get to the greatest number of locations and the greatest number of stations, because precisely when they privatized the train network in the 90s, they eliminated a fundamental transportation link to a great part of rural Mexico. And they're trying to bring that back because the bus network did not do that. And because a public service does not have to turn a profit. It's public. It's public. So if it goes to more stations and it doesn't, redound in your bottom line, well, tough, because it's a public service and it operates in the public interest. I had a French, very well-intentioned French anthropology student, because there's just so much hype in academic circles against the Tren Maya. Just they can't even hear of it. And so she made the case to me that the Tren Maya was unnecessary precisely because because the ADO bus system works really well. I'm like, really? First of all, buses are more contaminating than trains. You know that, don't you? Second of all, the ADO bus network, ADO bus network does not go to small towns. Basically none of them. You have to get from your small town to some hub to get the ADO bus. And thirdly, precisely because they privatized the train network in the 90s, ADO has a monopoly on transport throughout the entire southeast of the country, and they can charge what they want. I said, do you know, because I travel ADO more than a lot of these European academics do, that just to take a single round-trip bus ticket from Oaxaca to Mexico City now costs 2,000 pesos, which is 25% of the average monthly wage of this city. One round-trip bus ticket, Oaxaca, Mexico City, is 25% of the average monthly wage of Oaxacan. Imagine if you go with a family of 4. If you have to go to Mexico City, which people often have to do for academic reasons or for medical appointments or to see family members or to do some kind of bureaucracy, you've eaten up your entire monthly wage right there and more. Because there's no alternative to public transportation whatsoever. And this French anthropology student is lecturing that the Tren Maya is unnecessary, because the ADO system works so well. This is what happens when you decide to comment on a country that you don't know and haven't lived in enough. And then you come up with, these kind of articles like this, which just tries to twist everything against it, and it becomes, the legitimate criticisms that you could make get drowned out by all this lurid sensationalism of the stray dogs and the lack of departures and this idea that the stations are out of the center to avoid protests and on and on and on, Jose Luis. On and on and on.
And there was a line in there, scars that do not heal, right?
Oh, well.
We have talked a lot in this segment about this kind of coverage, about these efforts to really just construct a narrative, make it so that any kind of sympathy to this project, even with criticisms, is seen as unacceptable. The only acceptable position is that this project is bad and it's against, and the Mayan people don't like it and blah, 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 right? And this is just another one to add to the very big pile of stories just like this about Mexico that unfortunately do a disservice to this country. I want this project to succeed. I want there to be lots of travel. I want people to feel like they can have stable employment and get some income and sell their goods and whatever, right? I mean, we're talking about the population that was excluded for decades, if not centuries, right? This is a bet on them. Let's cheer for them as opposed to cheer against them, as this article clearly does, all with the worst grounds, right? Oh, environmental this, environmental that, absent of any actual context, of any actual understanding of the country, like the student you were talking about just now, right?
Right, and as if there aren't trains in France that go everywhere. But in France, they're allowed to have trains, but not in the Yucatan Peninsula. And just to point out, if people didn't know, local people have discounted fares on the train. If you're from the community, you have the lowest fare. If you're a Mexican citizen, you have the second tier fare. And if you're, a foreigner, you have the third tier fare. That's the point of this, that it's multi-use. It's not just that it not just be for tourists, that it also be for local use. And then once it gets going, for cargo as well. so that you don't overload the highway system in the country. The very expensive highway system in the country with some of the most expensive tolls in the world. That's the alternative you want people to be doing? Just say that then, if that's what you want.
And explain that to the people there. All right, we reached the end of another program. I want to thank you so much, Kurt. As always, excellent analysis, excellent breakdown. We are coming to you with a different software this time. We had some technical issues. This episode is going to get out a little bit late today, but we'll get it up as soon as possible. Do want to make an announcement that we are going to take a little break. So our next week's episode is going to be our last one for 2024, which is an incredible thing to say out loud. I can't believe it's going to be 2025. So we'll be bringing you probably more of like a year-end wrap-up. We're also planning some great stuff. We're going to be having some live episodes for you. We'll have some guests on next year. We're going to do a live show in Guanajuato. So more on that as soon as we have it for you. I want to thank everybody for joining us, viewers and listeners, and of course, and especially at the St. Patrick's Battalion, which is growing. We've got a bunch of supporters now. We really are super, super grateful for all of that. It makes it so much more possible to do this work, especially on days like today where the technical issues make it difficult, but we plow through. Kurt was like, let's figure out, we'll find a solution. And I was like, all right, Kurt, let's do it for the fans.
Let's keep it real here and call it out here. Riverside, you got to up your game. We've got a paid subscription to Riverside, which is the production, platform where we usually do this. And this is the third time they've crapped out. So if you don't up your game, Riverside, you're going to lose us and other clients. So,
wow.
Looking at you.
I even told them, I was like, your software for podcasters. Podcasters have a schedule, right? Like,
we have to get
the number one thing you have to do is be consistent when you're publishing, and you make it impossible. Right, like, we literally couldn't publish. Anyway, I'm glad we were able to. It's a great show we've had today, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.